in many places, soccer was being perceived wrongly, but was being perceived here in America as kind of a second-class sport. If you're a really good athlete, you're going to play football or basketball or baseball, and yeah, you can do rugby and you can do soccer, and you can do other little things if you're not a good enough athlete to do the main sports of America. And thankfully, I think my winning the Superstars, that may have been the best contribution that I had made to soccer, to get rid of that concept that the only reason a kid would play soccer is because he got cut from the football, basketball, or baseball team.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey everybody, it's Tim Hanlon. How are you? Thanks for joining me. It's Good Seats Still Available, that curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. We are enthralled, if that's the right word. I think it is, sure, to have as our guest a legend in American soccer circles, one of the preeminent and frankly first breakthrough American stars on the American soccer scene. His name is Kyle Rote Jr. And if anybody remembers back from the mid-'70s onward, Kyle Rote Jr. was not only the amazing American star for the Dallas Tornado of the old North American Soccer League, but also for a number of years, the preeminent athlete in a competition on ABC Sports known as the Superstars, where Kyle Rote Jr. Was an amazing physical specimen. Not that he's not now, but in those days, he was beating all kinds of sports stars in all kinds of other sports in this amazing competition that kept our attention in between the Super Bowl and the beginning of Major League Baseball. And Kyle won the Superstars tournament, I think 3 years running, including a second place finish in one of the years that he didn't win the title. So an amazing amount of stories and interesting anecdotes from Kyle Rote Jr., a legend and a Hall of Famer, coming up in a couple of seconds here on the show. Before we get there, I want to remind you that, of course, we are, again, sponsored by our friends at Audible, and a free 30-day trial of Audible's audiobook service, as well as a free audiobook download, is available for you to try when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats, and you will get those freebies, and you can cancel at any time. And as you know, Audible is the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from. Lots of great stuff in there. It is a great way to enjoy a book without having to read or strain your eyes. Perhaps you are busy doing something else, and the sound version of someone expertly reading a book to you is a better way to enjoy what the book is about. And it's what Audible does really well. They are arguably the best in the business, and we encourage you, as I have, to try it for yourself, and I guarantee you'll be hooked once you try your first audiobook for free. And again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats to get yours, a free 30-day trial as well. And like I said, you can cancel at any time, and there's no better way to give it a try than by trying our little link here. And you'll be giving a little love to the show, let's be honest. And we could always use a little love once in a while, a couple of shekels here and there to keep us going as we move ahead in our podcast journey together. It's audibletrial.com/goodseats. Give it a try. I guarantee that you will enjoy it. And I think you will like it just as much as I do. I hope so. Okay, enough promotional babbling. It is time for a wonderful and very interesting conversation with our friend, Kyle Rote Jr., here on the podcast. I think for our listeners, obviously, especially those who remember you from the earliest days of the old NASL, I'd love to sort of hear some of the beginnings of how you got involved into the sport of soccer. And we all certainly know you had a very famous father who was very prolific in the sport of American football. In some respects, arguably, you could have been suggested as being preordained as being a follower in his footsteps, pro football wise. How does somebody like that
That's
with
an
that
interesting
lineage?
phrase,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, how does somebody with that lineage get into the sport of soccer, especially at a fledgling level professionally in the United States at that time?
Actually, it was the 1966 World Cup that really got my interest. My best friend in the Dallas area, near the SMU campus, Henry Davis, his family had a British heritage, and so they were always somewhat aware of soccer. It's very difficult to even explain at this time now, 2017, how few soccer elements were going on in a place like Texas, which was just filled with American football activity and talent and that kind of thing. And so a good friend of mine who was a writer at the Dallas Morning News called me, ultimately ended up calling me a renegade because I started playing soccer, and my family, with my father having been the overall number one pick in the draft in 1951 in the NFL for the New York Giants, and then Tobin Rote, another family member, played I think 15, 16 years between AFL, NFL, and also played a couple of years up in Canada. There seemed to be a momentum towards going into football. I had played at Oklahoma State football coming out of high school. Had a very good first year. Ended up breaking my femur just above the knee in the last week of that season, and ended up using soccer actually as the way to try to get back in shape. At the same time, that same friend whose family oriented me towards the 1966 World Cup activities, when we had gone over to the SMU campus and their basketball arena, they had a closed circuit television. First time I had ever seen anything like that. And the closed circuit was the first time I had ever seen that, the technology-wise, but also had really never seen soccer before. And again, difficult to believe that in the mid-1960s, soccer was very active in St. Louis. Soccer was very active up in the Northeast, and soccer was active in most of the immigrant cities at some levels, Chicago, Detroit, San Francisco. So there were pockets of soccer around, but nothing like what it has evolved to today. And for those of us who were part of that missionary experience of helping bring soccer to the American general public, it's very, very satisfying for me to drive around any city that I may be visiting and to see how many young people are playing the game and enjoying the game. And it's not so much that they have to be great players, but when they have a smile on their face and they're joyous for having a chance to play, I think any of us who were part of that era in the late 60s and early 70s really feel like that we did accomplish a lot in terms of spreading the message of soccer's appropriateness to be a core American sport.
Well, so all right, so you're using soccer as a almost therapeutic and or diversionary kind of activity, right? And so how do you even get and obviously the World Cup and closed circuit, and you're aware of the sport's existence outside of your, I guess, your world of Texas and the Southwest and the Southeast. Where is the bright light that sort of hits you, if there is such a thing, that tells you that, maybe there's something more to this soccer thing than just a sideline to your football and other activities?
Well, as it turned out, I was in high school, was an all-state American football player. I was playing baseball. I was playing basketball as captain of the baseball team and the basketball team, so I was already involved in three sports pretty much full time, and headed to college on a football scholarship. But after having seen Jeff Hurst score 3 goals, I think it was, in the '66 final, and England's only World Cup championship in their history, but Jeff was not a messy dribbler. He wasn't the kind of player Eusebio or Pelé or Johan Cruyff, or those kinds of players who were highly skilled and could handle the ball. Jeff was a finisher, And I had never met Jeff. I just saw this man kind of do the very final thing. I guess the basketball analogy would be having a point guard, instead of shooting, throw the ball up towards the basket and have a big 7-foot center grab the ball, or an athletic, 6'6" guy come take the ball out of the air with one hand and dunk the ball. That one-touch finish was kind of what opened up the sport to me, because I realized and at that time I was 16, so I was trying to, again, continue my legacy career in American football at the time. But we started this organization in our public school called Highland Park, and we started a team called the Black Bandits, and the Black Bandits were basically a reference to an appreciation for the African American players, and the Bandits came out of LSU. They had a football team that one of their teams that they sent. They had an offensive team, they had a defensive team, but then they had a Bandits team. And the Bandits team were the crazies, and we felt kind of crazy because we were playing on American football fields. There were, in the public school system in Dallas, Texas, in the mid-1960s, there was no, and I repeat, there was no soccer, club soccer. There was no school soccer. The only existence of soccer that occurred in Texas in the mid-1960s, and let's just say 67, 68, the only ones, there were 4 or 5 private schools who were sending kids up to the Northeast, and where soccer had continued playing since probably the 1930s. And if they were going to go to Harvard or Dartmouth, or they were going to go to Yale, then they probably ought to get exposed to the game, because it was being played up in the Ivy League. But it wasn't being played in Texas, with one massive exception, and that massive exception were the Mexican immigrant teams that played on Sunday afternoon at several public, not arenas, but really locations there in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And that was the only soccer that really existed, unless you're willing to go out and watch what the Mexican guys were doing on a Sunday afternoon. And it was much more of a social context than it was hard soccer, even though they had some very good players there. But these were folks who came to America, and they were working hard to take care of their families. Sunday afternoon was their retreat with the other guys to be able to play their favorite sport, which wasn't being emphasized really anywhere in America other than a couple of the private schools and the Northeast and Chicago and San Francisco at the time. And so just the opportunity to start a team without a coach, without a general manager. And so here we are, 16-year-olds, and I'm already playing 3 sports and very active in all 3 of those sports. But my best friend and his family love the game of soccer. So I said, you know what, let's, what I just watched there on the SMU campus during the '66 World Cup, one thing that I knew was that these athletes were in shape. I may not be able to dribble a ball, may not be able to head a ball, may not be able to pass a ball, but I know fitness when I see it. And in the World Cup, obviously, the athletes of all the teams that were playing were highly fit, and that really impressed me. So just from a selfish standpoint, I said, I would love to have that level of endurance, and so let's go play. So Hank Davis, Tico Lawrence, and I put together an organization called the Black Bandits. We were not in any way recognized by the Highland Park Independent School District, but we started playing and and I recruited my best friends and good athletes from the football team, also from the basketball team and from the baseball team, and we pulled those good athletes together And as it turned out, after training probably for 2 months or so, we were replete with natural athletic ability on the team. We just didn't have a lot of soccer skills. But we ended up playing one of the local private schools and challenged them to play. Coach Landry, his son, was going to one of those schools and got in contact with that group and said, we'd like to play. We've never played a game. We had to figure out, and there were some referees who were in town and who had been working the private school system and worked some of the Mexican teams. And so we got a referee and we played. As it turned out, we won, but we didn't win based on dramatic, perfect soccer skills that would wow anybody. It was all pure power. It was all pure opportunity. It was speed. And it, again, going back to the 1966 World Cup when Jeff Hurst scored the 3 goals, he probably touched the ball in that match less than 3 minutes, certainly less than 2 or 3 minutes. He was just a finisher. So it wasn't as if we realized we didn't have to be able to dribble past everybody. And I think when we ended up beating this particular private school there in the Dallas area, that gave us confidence that we could take on other ones. And so we played Fort Worth Country Day after that, and then I started a league, and I was the commissioner of the league, and we hired referees, and we got started and played with about 6 teams there in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and that's really is what got us started. As it turned out, during that time, my best friend Hank Davis enrolls at the University of the South, a school called Sewanee in Middle Tennessee. It's a high academic. They used to call it kind of the Southern Harvard. I don't know that it was quite that level academically, but it was certainly a very good school. And they had committed that they were going to start playing collegiate soccer. And they played against Emory there in Atlanta and a number of other schools. And they were small schools. Most of the major schools, the Vanderbilts and the University of Tennessee and University of Georgia, they did not really have soccer programs that I recall. But Sewanee was going to have a varsity soccer program, and my best friend was going to be playing on that team. And so I ended up transferring over to that school after having spent some time in that previous summer in Europe with a gentleman by the name of Ron Griffith, who had come in 1967-68 to America as a reporter to follow some of those teams that had been leased to cities in America. And Ron's, direction, for example, we were throwing the ball in with one hand, and we said, why are these people throwing the ball in with 2 hands? And they can't throw it as far. And so we thought we had come up with a great, new advantage. And Ron skilled us really in you can't do certain things, and told us kind of what the rules were and all that kind of stuff. And so we just used a lot of the natural ability of our group of guys, and 4 of us went on to college on scholarships in American football, as it turned out. But we still had that core of best athletes from my baseball team, from my basketball team, and from the football team. And that's how the Black Bandits got started in 1967, and that group of guys continues on in many ways. We don't still play, but the memories of the challenges of playing without a coach, even though we made some mistakes, and the one-arm throw-in was an example of that. We were fortunate to have someone help us with the rules, and as it turned out, Ron, that very summer, this was the summer of 1968, I ended up going over with Ron and about 15, 16 players who had played at those private schools there in the Texas area, and a couple from Mexico. We went over and played in England, and Ron knew all the English people because he was a writer and a sports writer, and he had been following the 1967 teams that had come to America to play and kind of have a holiday, I think, more than anything. And it was, but he wanted to show Britain that even Texas, with it does have cowboys and it does have cows and it does have lots of wild space, but they're actually beginning to learn the world game. And so we went over there, and most of the guys were, again, about my age, about 16, and we ended up playing a lot of the youth teams. And my guess is, I don't know this for sure, but I think this is probably true, we played probably their 14, 15-year-old teams. We didn't play their 16-year-old teams. I think they would have just killed us at the time. But the very fact that we were able to play and the novelty of it all, Ron was such a good promoter. We wore 10-gallon hats. We wore bright orange jerseys and coats, and he understood, and he used to talk about Britain as being the number one color in England is gray. Gray skies, gray buildings, gray streets, and so he wanted to be noticed, and my goodness, were we noticed. Boots and 10-gallon hats, and just as we were walking around the general activities there in the England cities that we went to and we played in, we got a lot of media attention. And as it turned out, West Ham had contacted Ron about keeping me there for one of their youth programs. I was going back to start playing college football at Oklahoma State, and so I declined. But the fact that they had some scouts there looking at some of our players was a great encouragement, I think, to Ron and to all of us, that, my goodness, we're not the best players in the world, but they see some talent in us, and they gave me that opportunity, which, again, because of my football heritage, and I had never even thought that there would ever be an offer, and I didn't even understand how you could do that, because in America, with the college system, the way it's set up, over there, I had no idea that they were signing players 12, 13, 14 ages, at those ages, and they would train them soccer, but they'd also train them in blue-collar skills, electricians and plumbers and those kinds of things, so that they had another way to earn a living beyond the soccer if they didn't make it. And so it was a totally different system than the American academic system. And I will say, too, that I think their high school competency, most of the guys that I played with in professional soccer never went beyond what we would call high school. But their high school, it was certainly like a 2-year college. Their high competency, academic competency in their high school programs that we didn't have here really in the U.S. And so that was another discovery of mine during our month-long visit to England and Scotland. We also played in Ireland, and so Ron kind of took us around and entertained people in Britain, and to let them know that soccer has landed in America, and here's an example of even some Texans that are actually playing soccer and are adequate enough to be able to compete a little bit.
Well, okay, so there's another Ron that sort of comes into the mixture too, right? And I suspect the first Ron that you're mentioning, Ron Griffith, was instrumental in what I guess was a serendipitous scrimmage, right? I guess you were playing against the then Dallas Tornado, either as a scrimmage or maybe on a regular sort of informal basis. And is that perhaps how you got the attention of what was then the sort of fledgling NASL Dallas Tornado Ron Newman experience?
No, that's exactly right. And as you can imagine, they were looking for people to practice against and to train against. And so I pulled our Black Bandits together, and we knew, we would not win against a professional team, but they needed someone to practice against and someone to beat up on. And so we offered ourselves. And again, thankfully, we had enough just raw athleticism within our group that while they won every match, I'm sure that we ever played, but we just kind of gave them the opportunity, to play against. If you know, remember the game of basketball, the Washington Generals, were the team that ended up traveling with the Harlem Globetrotters, and the Harlem Globetrotters always beat the Washington Generals, and the Washington Generals were just there to kind of be the other team. There were no necessarily any stars or anything on. That's kind of how I felt at the time. We were really just trying to assist the Dallas Tornado so they could have some people they could train against. And our guys, we were all good enough athletes that we could match up athletically in terms of just running and endurance, for the most part. But we were so deficient in terms of major skill sets and in terms of handling the ball. We had a good goalkeeper who was a basketball player and 6'3" and could go up in the air and get the ball, and that certainly helped. But that is how I got exposed to Ron Newman, who was then the coach of the Dallas Tornado, and ultimately was the gentleman who, a few years later, ended up picking me in the first round of the very first NASL draft in 1972. Lamar Hunt was such a brilliant visionary. He felt like if we're going to Americanize soccer, we needed to add some of the very same structures that other sports had, and the draft was one of those. And so he added that, and again, I was fortunate in 1972, even though I was not playing in the Dallas area during my college career. The Atlanta Chiefs had already scouted me, and I had a number of teams that were looking at me at the time, but Dallas took me in the first round, and Ron was the one who made that selection, and he's the one who had seen me score a few goals against his Dallas Tornado in those little semi-intensive practice elements that we did with the pro team there. And so I'm very thankful that he had the confidence. And I think Lamar, if I recall, that may have also been the first year in which every NASL team had to have an American on the team. So in those early years, they brought in teams en masse from primarily from Britain, but from Europe, so that those players could kind of experience have the American experience of having seen our culture and having flown and all of those kinds of things. But obviously, all those teams went back intact. They didn't take any American players with them. And I was fortunate to be in that first group of Americans that by demand, I think, and by requirement, if you're going to be an NASL team in 1972, you need to have at least one American on your roster so that we can begin to infuse the American players into the culture of the North American Soccer League.
Well, sure, and arguably the full importation of teams saved the foundering league in the years prior, right? I mean, without those without the sort of genius of Phil Woosnam, kind of saying, well, we can quote unquote rent teams or adopt new personas for a summer. I mean, there were some very lean times before, and arguably even still lingering into 1972, which, by the way, now brings me into sort of where your head is at.
Our team happened to be in response was Dundee United, and so Ron Griffith was the reporter for Dundee United, and he was traveling with the team while it was in America. And he ultimately ended up staying here and started a whole kind of a soccer retail sports business to allow him to be able to stay here. But you're exactly right. In the 67, 68 era, and even just beyond that, they were bringing wholesale teams in, and there was no interaction with any American players at all.
So this is probably a good time to ask sort of this question, right? So as you think about being drafted in the first draft from this thing called the North American Soccer League, right? Obviously, you had some exposure to it, having worked with the Tornado in scrimmage fashion and meeting some of the personnel involved, right? So you had an inside understanding. But, from a, let's put it this way, a professional sports career perspective, right? And especially being the progeny of a national sports figure in his own right, and the name that comes along with that. How do you square that as an opportunity to pursue, given all the, I guess, uncertainty of the sport of professional soccer, certainly the league up until that point, and perhaps having a famous dad who's been successful? What is the calculus of saying, yes, I'm going to do this?
Well, the calculus, number one, was that soccer was becoming more of a world sport to those of us in America, and that we needed to join the rest of the world. And I called my father. We talked a little bit about it. He made a comment along the lines, and he didn't argue with me at all. He really freed me up, which I was very thankful for. And he said, you know what? Again, my dad was the overall number one pick in the draft in '51. He was captain of the Giants for 10 years. He was broadcasting at that time Super Bowls in the early days of the Super Bowls for NBC with Kurt Gowdy. He had a stellar reputation within sports in the league. Tobin also, again, Tobin Rote had a good reputation as well. And so he said, son, the world is expanding. We're sending people to the moon, or up into space and all of that. And we, go for it because you'll always be compared with me. You'll always be compared with Tobin. And if you stay in American football, that's going to be a difficult, hurdle to deal with. So create your own destiny, create your own path, and be one of the pioneers that bring soccer to America. And so I was frankly somewhat fearful when I made the phone call to say, Dad, here's what I'm thinking about doing. I'm going to leave a full scholarship at Oklahoma State and go play soccer at a place you've never heard of. It's Sewanee at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee, up on the Cumberland Plateau between Nashville and Chattanooga, and play against schools that you've never heard of. But he said, particularly after I got back from the trip with Ron Griffith to England, he said, go for it. And that was really at the time when I needed to hear something like that from him. So I got great support from all my family. And again, other than that reporter for the Dallas Morning News who called me a communist for having made the jump from American football, to soccer, I felt very supported and comfortable with that. So.
Well, it also sounds like it's somewhat liberating, right? Because what you talked about earlier, frankly, sounded like passion, right? You somehow stumbled into and/or became more passionate about this sport, right? Which was foreign and new, and you weren't necessarily, exceptionally skilled at it, but clearly, the fact that drives you to keep playing in sort of this renegade kind of way, setting up leagues and all that kind of stuff, that to me feels like passion. And when you have that, I got to think a difficult conversation with your dad. It sounds like, there's a lot of external pressure. And by having a conversation along those lines, it sounds like it depressurized, any intimation about what you should do with your life and truly pursue your life the way you want to.
Well, and Tim, it couldn't have been more a surprise to me that he immediately supported the idea. I thought I was going to have to argue him into this, and but I did not. And again, for someone as he was, having again broadcasting Super Bowls for the NFL and doing the Game of the Week for NBC, and he had a pretty good perspective about world sport. And again, I think part of his reason in terms of encouraging me was to help me avoid the ultimate comparison against him and Tobin, if indeed I continue to stay on the American football path. So being able to, there was no comparison obviously within our family if I went the soccer route, and I really was surprised when he kind of twisted on me and said some things to me about I'd be an idiot not to follow this opportunity. And I think he was trying to protect his son, trying to protect me from what ultimately was going to be perhaps a disappointment, and trying to deal with that comparison. And he was very mindful of that, and I'm very thankful that wherever the idea came from and wherever the inspiration came from, he was very supportive of me, his son, in what I wanted to do, and he wasn't trying to control my life. He wasn't trying to control the way God had gifted me athletically, and I'm very, very thankful for that.
Well, it sounds like you had a quite a head start then when you were drafted. Maybe you can kind of walk our audience through sort of, I don't know, the first impressions about this league that you were now officially a part of, the Dallas Tornado, which was arguably the strongest, if that's the right word, franchise in the still fledgling league. How wide were your eyes opened as you became a quote-unquote professional soccer player in the United States in 1972?
Well, I was very fortunate that I had read a number of books about disasters of people trying to go into new things and all of that kind of thing, and just I was very fortunate to have a bunch of players, and Ron Newman helped with this in great deal, because they looked upon me, they knew of me because we had done those practice events during the summers and prior years. So I already knew who the players were. I knew them at a certain level. They understood that I did have a great deal of athleticism that God had gifted me with, that I did have some skill sets that they could perhaps enhance. And so what I ended up doing was at various times particularly during that first year, I didn't join the team in 72 until probably 2/3 of the season was gone, because I had to graduate, and I got married the day after graduation, and my wife and I came to Dallas, and the season was already halfway done at the time. So that was really an opportunity for me to have a couple of months to be with the guys, train with the players. And what I did was I asked a number of the players, and I'll mention a few of them. Bobby Moffett was one, and you've talked to Bobby on this podcast in the past. Ken Cooper, who was our wonderful goalkeeper, who really should be in the American Soccer Hall of Fame. We had Dick Hall, Mike Renshaw, a number of players who were extremely unselfish, because this is what I would do. These guys were all kind of bivocational. Everybody had another job in addition to being a pro soccer player for the Dallas Tornado, because you didn't make enough as a pro soccer player to totally survive. And so that was kind of the time frame, of the era. And what I did was I'd ask each one of those guys, for example, Kenny Cooper, I'd say, Kenny, we don't know each other well, but it would really be helpful if you wouldn't mind after practice today, let's get some water, take a couple minutes rest, and then if you wouldn't mind for 15, 20 minutes, teach me the best places for me to try to score a goal as someone who's going to be a forward on this team. and what makes you uncomfortable. Help me understand I want to get the goalkeeper out of his comfort zone, and so would you show me how's the best way to manage that? And so he would let me know that when you make a run like this really messes me up and it makes me unsure as to what's going to happen. And I did the same thing with every Dick Hall, who was our center defender in the back in front of Kenny. Dick was very, very helpful to me, even though he's probably 5'8", but he was a really good tackler of the ball, and he was the one who really encouraged me. You've got to use your speed because you're not going to be able to outskill anybody. You're not going to outskill me. And so you got to push the ball past me and run and go get it and make it a athletic race. Don't make it a skill competition. Then Mike Renshaw and other members of that group, they all had positions on the team, and I needed to kind of learn what it was to be the best contributor on the team, and how I could provide some level of goal scoring success to the team, and getting information from those defenders. So John Best and some of the other guys who had been there with Ron for a couple of years, they all spent extra time, and they had no obligation to spend any time with me at all. And they did it because we were all part of the mission of bringing soccer to America and trying to expose it and do as well as we could. But these guys could have said to the American kid, the new kid in the locker room, no, I'm going home. I'm tired. We've run our sprints. We've done all this extra work, and you got to figure it out yourself, kid. And I will say that Ron did a fabulous job of indoctrinating those players of that era, that their major job was not so much to win, even though they did, and they won in '71, won the championship, but it was also that we had to bring soccer to the rest of the community. And so every single player on the team, I think without exception, spent time in kind of civic activities, going to schools, doing exhibitions, and I mean, it was as simple. Sometimes I went down to Waxahachie, which is south of Dallas, not quite an hour, and went into a school, and I just held up a soccer ball and said, this is a soccer ball, because they had never seen a soccer ball. They knew football, basketball, baseball, but they never really knew what a soccer ball was. And we did that in great part. And one of our guys who you've talked to in the past, Bobby Moffitt, Bobby saw his vision as all of West Texas. And so Bobby did a fabulous job over the years of exposing West Texas, which is a very dry, unpopulated part of the state. But he went to Lubbock, he went to Abilene, he went to a number of cities that the rest of us never went to, and he to help plant the seeds of bringing soccer to the youth of that community. And I think all of us were really focused on getting the kids to smile, getting the kids to realize there was another way in which they could participate in athletics beyond the obvious ones that they were aware of from national TV and all that stuff. And so I really do think that the phrase for us was kind of soccer missionaries, and that was emphasized by Ron Newman at a level that none of us wanted to fight Ron physically. I can say that too. And Ron just had that high energy. We have to go. The phrase was anytime, anywhere. And so we all did anytime, anywhere activities and events all over the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and for some like Bobby Moffitt, sometimes even out to West Texas. So it was a kind of a dual purpose, play the game well, win for Dallas, win for our team, but at the same time, you have an obligation to not miss an appointment and to get out and to share the greatness of the game.
All right, well, let's shift into 73 then, because that's when you obviously became a starter, you became a regular player, and arguably you became quite the red hot sensation on a grander scale that I don't think even you would have imagined. But how did you lead up? How did you get into your playing groove, so to speak? Right, obviously you were a North American player. The league is obviously looking at American players, especially to be part more of the mix. And in 72, you sort of been exposed to a team that's very passionate and missionary in its work. How do you segue into being a full-time and regular player to break into that first team?
Well, I had to earn it in practice, and I had to earn it with the confidence of the players around me. And I think those moments of time that each of those players invested in me thankfully brought some fruit, and that gave me the opportunity. Part of it is that we had two other players that we were bringing in from England. They got held up at immigration, and this is what, as I recall the story, they got held up in immigration. And so even though I had been playing their position as center forward, I was going to play some for sure, but it wasn't really until they got held up, these two players, and so we had to go to play our very first game. As it turned out, I had to play because these two guys came in, and to this day, I don't know if Ron, who was such a clever marketer, I don't know if he did this on purpose or not, but they announced that I was going to be starting for the Tornado, and they had a huge crowd show up because of that. And as it turned out, I scored a goal and had an assist, I think, on the second one. And all of a sudden now, Ron's confidence in me and my teammates who had worked with me, they saw that I might, be able to do well, and that really kind of opened everybody's eyes. And so, as it turned out, the following week, those guys did get through immigration. They came over, and Richie Reynolds was one of them. Was an excellent center forward type player, and as it turned out, we ended up playing with each other. We just kind of moved the things around, and in part because of the crowd that we got that first game that I was playing in. I think no one's ever told me this, but I believe that Lamar Hunt said to Ron, you got to play this guy because if he's attracting fans like this, we need to keep that going. And as it turned out, before the end of the year, I had won the scoring championship in the league, primarily because of kind of one-touch passes to me somewhere around the goal. And so I'm trying to remember, I think I may have been the only American to have ever won the scoring, American-born player, to ever have won the scoring championship in the NASL. But that was due in great part to the guys around me who were not selfish and who were willing to let an American kid do well. And so they get a lot of credit for their willingness to let an American have some success in the game that was their passion and their greatest love.
Well, okay, so there's a bit of modesty there, which is par for the course for anything with Kyle Rote Jr. Discussion, right? But because you were not only the leader in the scoring for the league that year, and the first American, and I do believe the only American still to have done that, but you were also named the Rookie of the Year. And But there's also sort of another element here, right? Because, and maybe you sort of sowed some seeds there with your commentary about maybe what Lamar Hunt was thinking, but you were clearly gaining attention beyond that, right? I mean, there was a big Sports Illustrated article about you in August of that year, kind of touting you as sort of the great, I guess, American hope for this league and for this sport. You were, although not necessarily featured, but you were on the cover of Sports Illustrated a month later during the unfortunate loss to Philadelphia in the championship game. And you were also starting to get recognized, right, on a grander and more national scale. It seems like there were, I got to think your name, right, was part of that. I think the Americanization desire of the league was part of that, and Lamar Hunt and Ron Newman's, I guess, promotional considerations were part of that. But did you feel at any time during the course of that 1973 season that other things were being maybe put on your shoulders or expected of you beyond just being a good player on the field?
Well, they were in one sense. I was sent out a day early on away games so that I could kind of be the marketer for soccer. So whenever we played an away game, many times, I want to say forever, most of the time I was sent out a day early to go into that town, kind of do the marketing pitch to get people to come play the game the next day. So I kind of missed the last practice before we would go on the road, but I was doing active marketing on behalf of the other teams in the league in their own hometown. So that was part of that. I guess that was part of it. But the other thing that happened was being invited among other elite athletes to an event called the ABC Wide World of Sports Superstars. And because of having some success in professional soccer, it gave me the opportunity to go against O.J. Simpson and Lynn Swann and Roger Staubach and all the great athletes in the world of sports, and the Olympians and Olympic decathlon gold medalists and all those great athletes. So that 1973 year was really the linchpin that not only opened it up for other Americans, but also from a personal standpoint, may have been the best marketing piece that Lamar couldn't control, but it just so happened that ABC Wide World of Sports, they needed a soccer player, and I had won the scoring championship, and so they, and obviously there's name recognition that came from my father, who was still very active as a broadcaster for NBC, and but that put me in a position, and then when I won it 3 of the 4 years that I was in the Superstars, that eliminated one of the key elements that or key observations, I guess, that most Americans thought about soccer. They thought, well, yeah, you guys are in shape, but you're not really athletes. And so when I beat all the athletes from the NFL, the NBA, and all the other sports, that gave us another hook to kind of hang on, to be able to say, you know, soccer was not just about controlling the ball, it's very athletic as well, and soccer players are great athletes as well. So in many places, soccer was being perceived wrongly, but was being perceived here in America as kind of a second-class sport. If you're a really good athlete, you're going to play football or basketball or baseball, and yeah, you can do rugby and you can do soccer, and you know, you can do other little things if you're not a good enough athlete to do the main sports of America. And thankfully, I think my winning the Superstars, that may have been the best contribution that I had made to soccer, to get rid of that concept that the only reason a kid would play soccer is because he got cut from the football, basketball, or baseball team. Before we get off of 73 for a second and go into this other stuff,
I thought I had heard something, and I don't know where, but we kind of try to uncover these little pieces of sometimes apocryphal information. But there was that famous...
Is this an aha moment?
Well, it may be. Let's see. So in September, right, so when Sports Illustrated had that cover of the NASL championship game, right? And by the way, I think people today need to know, how just dramatically jarring or significant putting the North American Soccer League circa 1973 on the cover of Sports Illustrated, which was at the time, the preeminent sports publication in this country, right? That was a major editorial decision.
Yes, it was.
But my understanding, and tell me if you know this to be correct or not, that you were the one who was going to be featured on that cover should Dallas have won, but you guys didn't, and thus Bob Rigby got the sort of the accolade, so to speak, despite your picture as well.
No, that's exactly right. And in fact, they came to town early, and we spent hours taking photos so that it could be a cover. And the idea of the cover ultimately ended up being a poster that was sold by Sports Illustrated with me jumping up in the air and kicking the ball and all of that. But they had already laid it out as we were a favorite. We weren't a dominant favorite. Obviously, anytime you go into a championship game, the other team is very, very good anyway. And so they came into Dallas several days early. We shot a whole bunch of photography for them that they hoped was going to ultimately be on the front cover of Sports Illustrated. And I spent hours with their photographer in things that he wanted to do. And again, ultimately what happened is he ended up having to use one of his in-game shots where I was challenging Bob Rigby for a ball that Bob was able to catch, and I could not get up high enough to head the ball. And that became the cover for Sports Illustrated when Philadelphia beat us there in that final. But all the other photos that we had made on previous days before we got to the finals, to that final championship game, one of those ended up becoming a very, very popular just kind of a banner, so much so that several years later I was speaking to our U.S. women's team as they were going through, one of their first world championships and gold medal type things, and about 2/3 of those ladies all had that poster up in their room or in their house or wherever it was, what school they were going to. And so that poster became extremely popular, even though it was intended initially, as you said, for the cover. But we did not win, and so Bob Rigby, I'm in the picture, but it wasn't a one-on-one picture. The one that we shot for Sports Illustrated was just me kicking a ball up in the air, not quite an overhead kick, but it was a very athletic type of shot. And I'm sure, they scrambled a little bit, and then they chose a picture that had been shot that day, actually at the very championship game, and with Bob being featured as he should have been.
Fair disclosure, I had that poster as well. Just had to throw that in there. So, okay, so let's just ask maybe one more sort of general questionnaire, and then we'll put it on pause so that you can get on with your life for the rest of today. But you did mention the superstars, right? So clearly, 1973, you were getting a lot of exposure in a lot of other circles, right? For whatever reason, obviously your prowess on the field, your American name in a quote unquote foreign sport, the marketability, I guess, just by the nature of your actual name, a lot of things going in your favor. How does the superstars conversation even begin? How do you even get involved in the superstars? How do you, is it an agent? Is it somebody who, do you get a call in the middle of the night? I mean, how does it even sort of pop up?
Well, it's all of those. I did have an agent after I won the scoring championship, and he happened to be with the agency IMG, and IMG had a subsidiary of their organization that was the founder, really, of the Superstars competition. And as it turns out, it was highly successful for a number of years, and this is before cable. And so on a Sunday afternoon in the middle of the winter, you're watching people down in Florida, these great athletes, compete with each other. So it was an extremely popular series, and they needed somebody from the soccer, or they thought, because they were bringing in gold medalist speed skaters from Europe, and they were bringing in boxers, and they were bringing in great Rod Lavers and the great tennis players, and the best athletes in the world. There was only two of the great athletes of that era that never participated in Superstars. Muhammad Ali really was one of those, and Will Chamberlain was the other, who was playing professional basketball. But every other sport sent its most elite athletes to compete in the Superstars, and so much so that years later, when I was an agent helping get some players signed by NFL teams, they actually have a Superstars clause in the contract. And what the contract says essentially is you cannot participate in Superstars type events without the permission of your club or of your NFL team. And so that's was an interesting activity, because there was some risk. We were very fortunate. Very few athletes ever, because everybody was in good shape, so very few people ever got hurt or pulled hamstrings or anything like that. We did have one bicycle accident with a safety for the Miami Dolphins during my era that thankfully did not break anything, but I think that woke everybody up to say, wow, there is some risk here, and if we're going to be paying these guys lots of money, we have the right to be able to exclude them from activities like this.
Okay, friends, sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to quickly remind you that today's episode of Good Seats Still Available is brought to you by our friends at Audible, the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from in just about every genre you could think of. Audible titles play on iPhone, Kindle, Android, and more than 500 devices and MP3 players for listening anytime, anywhere. And for a limited time, my audience can listen to a free download of any book that they choose, as well as get a 30-day free trial when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you can choose from over 180,000 titles, as we said, including one that I'm listening to right now. It's called The 10-Gallon War by John Eisenberg. That's the story of the NFL's Cowboys, the AFL's Texans, and the feud for Dallas's pro football future. Another one on my list, which I have yet to download but is on my queue, that could be interesting to our audience here, is called The National Forgotten League by Dan Daly, entertaining stories and observations from pro football's first 50 years. Those are just two of the many thousands of titles to choose from, and not just in sports history, but you name the genre that you might want to listen to, and Audible's got it. By the way, two guests perhaps that we'll have on the show, hopefully sometime soon. But again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial, as well as your free audiobook download to try it out for yourself. Again, that's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. It is a little known sort of fact. I mean, this, what you're referring to is the arrival of Pelé, right, with great fanfare. And it seemed like, my understanding is that the league felt that it was important enough to literally create an exhibition game right smack dab in the middle of the season. And I guess convince a national television audience via CBS that it was it was worth the event. Now, going back to your earlier comment about being sort of the Washington Generals, it almost feels like it had a little bit of that sort of element to it, and you were the team chosen, but you had a game the night before a couple of thousand miles away, right?
Yep, and I was stunned just from a logistical standpoint that they would cut it that close. But I think they had a backup airplane that we did not know about, so that it had there been any problem going with regular service, they could have picked us up and still gotten us there. And so I don't know that for sure, but as I look at it, there's no way. How would you do, because it was an international television broadcast. It wasn't just in the U.S., so that was a tremendous element of it with CBS. But there was also an international feed going because of, obviously, Pelé's. It had nothing to do with the Dallas Tornado. We were the Washington Generals. But we went up 2-0. Ultimately, Pelé scored to tie it up 2-2, and we ended the match at 2-2, if I recall. I think that's right. And that was the official welcoming of Pelé to the U.S. And even though when he played, he did play, I think, a couple of club games with his club team, a couple of exhibitions years before, and I don't recall who they were against, but in terms of him coming to America, signing a contract with an American team, that was the big deal. Because, we get internationals all the time, not at the level that we have right now, but back then we'd have the occasional, every year or two, we'd have an international game with U.S. national team, and so there'd be some really good players involved in that game, but this was, set up for television, and television drove the whole thing. I remember we went through several kind of trials of where are we going to exchange flags, and what are we going to say to each other, and that kind of thing. And so, anyway.
Well, you were captain for that game, I believe, correct?
Yeah, I was, but it was just as you said. This was all kind of made up because it didn't count at all within the NASL league pool at all, and they chose us primarily because I, at the time, was, I guess, the most well-known American athlete playing soccer, and so I'm aware of that, and I was happy to play the role because that was just an extension of when we went to Waxahachie, Texas, to an elementary school. This was still part of the marketing of soccer, even though obviously there was an athletic element to it all. And every single teammate of mine, it was just stunning. When the game was over and it was 2-2, every single one of my teammates ran to Pelé to try to get his jersey. I didn't realize how important it was to them and how important Pelé was to them. Because I've been around, Roger Staubach and Julius Erving and, all those American iconic athletes, many times, and grew up in the New York Giants locker room in a sense. And so Frank Gifford, Pat Summerall, all those people, was well known to. But that's the thing, in addition to people running onto the field, which shouldn't have happened, but in any event, it was a very strange, quick turn. It was like they were all trying to get close to Pelé as the clock went down. Whenever they sensed that we had a minute or so to go before the match was going to be over, I could just see people kind of going towards him, and I thought they were going to shake his hand. Not ask for his jersey and be willing to switch jerseys with him, which is, a very common tradition internationally. And Pelé and I did a number of events together, in and around that year and a couple of other years. And so, and he gave me his jersey and signed it and all that kind of stuff without just one day at an event. It was a deal that we did in Manhattan. I can't remember exactly what the reason we did it, but it was just an aside to the game and another marketing piece that the NASL was trying to do to raise attention and that kind of thing. And so I still have the jersey, still have the signature, and as I recall, it said "Do Amigo," to my friend. I don't know Portuguese, and I know Spanish reasonably well, but anyway. So and we haven't. I know kind of where it is, but we haven't protected it. If the moth could get it, I don't know. And I shouldn't say that because I'll get my old friends from the team who will say, well, if you're not going to take good care of it, if you're not going to put it in a plastic, or you're not going to put it in a vacuum sealed area so it doesn't, deteriorate, give it to me, that kind of thing. So.
Well, I think the National Soccer Hall of Fame, when it reemerges next year in Frisco, Texas, would probably love to have that too. Yeah,
that's true. Good point.
Is there anything else you remember about that game? Because there was also another famous story that Pelé was almost to the point of walking away after halftime because he felt he had fungus on his shoes and his feet. But the reason, of course,
there
was
were a whole bunch. There was if you watched the match, several issues came up. One was because it was set up for television. They sprayed the field didn't have green grass on it. So about a day or two before they realized that, and they sprayed the field green, and a whole bunch of us came away with little green patches on our shorts and on, to some degree on the jerseys and that kind of thing. And they did the best they could, but it was very slippery, and all of us were wearing, cleats. So we should not have had a problem. But if you just look in the first 5 or 10 minutes of the match, you see a lot more sliding, and they weren't sliding tackles. It was because of the instability of the grass, and so several of us ended up, at the end we start looking at our stuff, and between our pants and our shirt, we ended up having some of the green had come off, and they had not sprayed it early enough to let it dry. So it was still wet.
It's just it's just unfathomable, and plus I saw a crowd, an international television audience watching. You kind of have to pinch yourself at some point and go, "What's going on here?"
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, and the value that they had, that you place on Pelé and all the other players too, because they're good players on both, on both teams. But you don't want anybody to get hurt, and it was not a good field. It happened to be the best available place to play it, a grass field, without empty seats, without a lot of empty seats. I mean, there were some empty seats there, I think, but still, right there in New York, it was perfect for media, easy access. We flew in and went straight from the airport to the locker room. I mean, that part was this, the crazy thing to me was how close they cut it, and I don't know what they would have put on the air if we had not made it in.
It's fascinating stuff. Although I don't know if anybody will miss the old Downing Stadium on Randall's Island. It was a stadium that was. I guess ramshackle would be a kind and charitable word for it.
That is kind, yeah. No, there was no question. We could have played it in the outdoor of Yankee Stadium. I mean, outfield of Yankee Stadium or any other good place. But so the ball bounced where it shouldn't bounce, and I think a lot of on both teams. A lot of if you watch just the videotape of the game. It wasn't nearly as smooth as the field was not smooth. So you had a lot of bumps, and you had a lot of digs, and you had a lot of other. And the ball, in addition to people slipping, the ball didn't go true as you would want it to go. All of a sudden, it's rolling along fine. All of a sudden, it hits a bump and it pops up. And you can't avoid every one of those, but you shouldn't have had them at the rate that we had them during that match.
Well, so let's talk about that sort of time, right? So 75, right? You're basically an American household word, right? The Superstars thing. Obviously, you're you're the shining light of American soccer on this league that is now, really starting to get some roots. I think in 75, you're up to 18 teams, and with more yet to come. Was there any? I'm trying to find the right word. A jealousy, or did people sort of, other players in the league kind of just sort of, have a jaundiced eye maybe to you and your stardom while they were toiling and trying to sort of, keep the game going while you were getting all this sort of national attention outside of the game, or was it all a good sort of positive booster shot for the NASL, or was it maybe somewhere in between?
Well, I think that was probably, I think it was more the latter. I think people saw, the players saw that if this helps get their attendance, if ultimately this will help get them paid more, there's more media out coming to our matches. I think they saw it in that context, that let's ride this horse as long as we can. And there was no question that when you go back and you just look at some of the guys that the Gordon Banks, Jeff Hurst, Georgie Best, Canaglia, Franz Beckenbauer, Johan Cruyff, we ended up having in our league, Eusebio from Portugal, we ended up having, some of the greatest players of all time coming through and interestingly, they were able, unlike what happens in most other countries in the world, they could have a civil life here. They weren't being harassed all the time. People weren't yelling at them. They could raise a family, if they wanted to. In fact, our former U.S. Head coach, who just, left us this last year, that was one of the reasons he moved to Los Angeles, because in Los Angeles, nobody knew who he was. And he could bring his family there, and they wouldn't have to worry about security and someone taking one of his kids, for ransom and that kind of stuff. And so there are a lot of, I wish the sport had been much more popular and wish we could have made it more popular quicker. But at the same time, one of the benefits for a lot of the foreign players was there was no pressure, anything like what the pressure was back home. And I think they really enjoyed that.
Well, but the real money, though, for the players really hadn't kicked in yet, right? You're mentioning all those great international.
It never did, actually. For our group, it did perhaps for the Cosmos, but some of the teams are willing to put more money into players, but that was not the case. We got some moderate support, and I love Lamar Hunt for a whole bunch of reasons, but he was a little bit more moderate and not going crazy, not trying to just go buy wins and buy success. He understood, just like he did in the football side, and that's why he's the only person I know who's in 3 Hall of Fames, the Tennis Hall of Fame, the Soccer Hall of Fame, Football Hall of Fame. He always wanted what was best for the leagues that he was in, not what was best for him. And that's a dramatic difference today with most owners. It's more than just Jerry Jones with the Dallas Cowboys. We're talking about most owners pushing for the economic benefits of being an owner. And Lamar was one of those who was not. His first, and the reason, the Lamar Hunt Trophy is given in the NFL. It's not because his teams won the most Super Bowls. It's not because he was chairman of the board most of the time. The reason it's called the Lamar Hunt Trophy is because he was the most consistent in the NFL, the most consistent person in terms of raising what's best for the league, what's best for football, what's best for other people, not in any kind of a selfish way. And he certainly had that same attitude, from a soccer standpoint. So I'm sorry, I don't know how we got on that rabbit trail.
Well, no, that's great, because I mean, it leads me to another question. Sort of, I mean, you're now sort of at the sort of the big turning point. Arguably, you're a big component of that, right? Where the NASL, is going from just barely surviving when you got in 72, 73, right, to now at the precipice in like 78, fueled by a lot of current Pelé and post Pelé and star stuff. 24 teams, I mean, all that kind of stuff, and salaries sort of rising, and big money or bigger money trying to chase. It felt like it was kind of a double-edged sword, right? I mean, while you relished, especially having been there in the earlier days, all the attention and the progress that the sport makes on the professional level in this country for the first time, arguably, but yet, people like Lamar Hunt, and I would argue maybe some of the players, maybe including yourself, maybe this gets a little out of control, or are we spending like drunken sailors a little bit, or, are we getting a little too big for our britches too quickly? What was the dynamic there?
We had Lamar and I had a midnight negotiation in, I think it was 75, maybe 76, down at a hotel there in Dallas. And a very funny thing happened. My wife went with me, and he and I talked for about an hour and a half, and it was all about we have to have balance, and we need to pay you more, but we can't go crazy. And I understood what he was saying, because they still hadn't made any money, and he and his partner were continuing to deficit finance probably a good bit of what was going on. And so there's no big economic windfall that should be shared with the players, but speaking, on behalf, we end up getting in the elevator down at this hotel in downtown Dallas, and we had just agreed to what my salary was going to be for that next year, and it was not anything. I can't remember exactly what it was, but let's say it was 15,000. I don't know what it was, but I think, and that went from 6,000 to 15. So, so I became easily the highest paid player on the Dallas squad. And as we're in the elevator, this is like 3:00 in the morning, and I think he took a nap that afternoon to get me tired. He's a very clever negotiator too, but I love the guy. And my wife and I are in the elevator, and he says, "Oh, and one more thing. We need to have a non-disclosure clause, in the contract," because he knew what would happen if I had some teammates who were all-stars and in various years and previously and all that. And so he makes this statement, and my wife has not said a word the whole night. Okay, she's just listened. And as we get in the elevator, he says, "And yeah, one more thing, we'll end up putting a non-disclosure clause in your contract as well. And I just hope that you can honor that, and we'll try and do the best that we can," something like that. And he said, "Is that going to be a problem?" And my wife then chirps in and says, "Mr. Hunt, you don't need to have a non-disclosure clause in my husband's contract. We're as embarrassed about the amount of money you're getting ready to give him as you are. We're not going to tell anybody." And it was one of those moments in my life when my wife said something that in terms of, we're just as embarrassed about the amount of money you're going to pay him as you are, and we're not going to tell anybody. And it just hit a humorous chord for both of us, and for all three of us actually, because she hadn't said a word about anything. And the one comment that she makes, she ends up having quite a comic viewpoint to it all.
That's hilarious. But that said, though, you clearly were making some endorsement money on the side. I mean, look, anybody who does a little Google search will find multiple brands and products that you were.
Well, yes, again, that we're still in an era where, for the most part, every player had to have an alternate job. Kenny Cooper worked for Dr. Pepper. Dick Hall, maybe still he's probably athletic director now, but he was the soccer coach for, I think it was Green Hill, if I recall, Green Hill Academy. All of us had to have extra revenue beyond what we were being paid, and that was a carryover really from the early 70s. And to all my teammates' credit, they all understood that was the deal. We are here not just to win games; we're also here to win people. We're not here just to make money. This is about giving an opportunity to play and to see America, and several of those people obviously have become citizens and have been very good contributors. And Bobby Moffitt's a really good example. That was just the era. And I give Ron Newman credit for this because, as I think I mentioned to you earlier, he was very adamant and very strong in what the guidelines and the rules were. And so we all understood that if someone from the front office called us and said, "Can you make an appearance at Jefferson Elementary School right after practice on Tuesday," it was yes ma'am, yes sir. It was, we're going to go do it. And did you get paid anything? Absolutely not. That was just part of the adventure and the venture and the vision, and with very few exceptions, and there were a few, but particularly among the older guys who had been there around for a while, getting Kenny Cooper and Bobby Moffitt and Roy Turner and those guys, they all totally understood what this was about. Yes, it's about playing good soccer, entertaining soccer, winning soccer, but it's also about winning a region of America that is focused on a totally different world of football for the most part, and not to ever eliminate. And the purpose, and to this day, I don't ever want to hurt American football. I just want to get world football on an equal status with our citizenry, and it's in many ways has achieved that. And so then that's a great satisfaction. I wish it had happened earlier. I wish it happened while we were playing, but it has certainly come about in many ways.
Well, all right. So let's maybe get to the tail end of your Tornado career, because obviously you had a new coach came in '76. So, Ron Newman, obviously having led the team for quite some time. And ironically, the guy, Al Miller, who was the coach of the team that beat you in '73 in the final, different sensibilities, the league obviously growing by leaps and bounds. And then you wind up finding yourself in an expansion team in Houston. How does that come about?
Well, let's go back to a little bit. I had a really good year in '77. I was somewhere in the top 10. I don't remember what it was, but again, it was we're playing against Hawaii. We're playing against, and I don't know exactly what the riff was between Ron Newman, if there was any, and Lamar. I, in many ways, wish Ron was willing to have been willing to stay, and I probably could have found out what the reasons were. But as a player, that's really not your job. You just, whoever the coach is, you do what you can. And Al Miller had a different philosophy of how to play, and he was. And he had every right to do it the way he wanted to. He wanted to do it. That did not necessarily favor me, because that was just a different style, we got a really good player, Jeff Bourne, in.
Sure.
And Jeff was kind of became. He was a better player than I was, as at that certainly at that position at forward, in terms of more, in terms of skill sets and the way in which of holding on to the ball and that kind of thing. And he could hold on to the ball a lot better than I could. And so I don't have any, I cheered for Jeff and consider him a friend and that kind of thing. So it wasn't, I just wanted the mission of soccer coming into America to continue to go. I had the chance to ride at the helm of it for a while, but I certainly didn't have to stay there, forever. Ron just had Al just had a different thing. And ironically, as an American, Ron was always a good coach, and he was really wanted to bring some players in from overseas, and I probably ought to just stop at that. He just had a different philosophy, and you deal with it. And then we ended up going down to Houston. But I think it was during Al's time. Had a hat trick against Hawaii, and I had a good year in I think in the '77 year, and then Al. No one ever told me this, but my sense was, and Al and I talk, once a year or so, and we don't have any problems with each other. But he wanted to bring some other people in, and we wanted to upgrade in some ways. And the fact that I might have been a stronger marketing tool for the club was not as important to him as it would have been to maybe the fans and maybe to some other folks. But, when you're head coach, ultimately you impose the way in which you look at the game. And Bobby Moffett was gone by then. He wanted to make some changes, and, Lamar gave him that. And so when Timo Liakowski ended up going down to Houston, that was an opportunity, for Timo to bring me down there. And so I had scored when Timo was already down there, I had scored against Houston out at the Astrodome that previous year, and had a good game in our match down there, and I just hadn't seen him in a while. And I don't know all of the interactions of what all was paid and what Houston ended up paying Dallas for me to come down there. And as a player, you don't have a choice. There's no free agency at that time. It is, we were all kind of going through a transition. Baseball was, football was. We all were in terms of players' rights and those kinds of things. And so if Houston is where we go, that's where we go. And so,
well, for our listeners, I think it's important to know that Timo Liakowski was an assistant coach, I guess, with Dallas before he went to Houston. Correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, so he and I already had a good relationship, and he understood me. He understood the work ethic and all that. But he also had a different philosophy when we got to Houston, and he did, I think, everything humanly that a coach could do to get some wingers some really good wingers from Europe. And I don't know of his relationship with the ownership. He could talk to that, but he told me about a week before we started the season that, we're going to have to play a different style. I promised you that we'd get wingers. We weren't able to do that, and I'm sorry. And so I give him credit, as a man for him to tell me straight up kind of what they were going to do, and they were going to try to. We were going to try to be a much more ball control team, and because if you can't have wingers who can keep throwing balls into the box, you've got to have a different philosophy. And we ended up having a excellent year. I couldn't have been more thrilled for Timo and for the team and the young man from Mexico who ended up replacing me, and he was excellent on the ball and scored, some really good goals. And we had maybe I don't want to say it's the best record that Houston's ever had, but certainly during that era, we had a really good success rate. And so I think as a player, every player wants to play, for sure. And I wanted to play. I wanted to contribute. They were paying me very well, and very well relative to other people. Not very well relative to baseball, football, or NBA. But anyway, being paid.
Well, you put that in context, right? I mean, in '78, the Houston Hurricane, I think tied for at least the worst record in the league at 10-20. And I think part of that was, from what I understand, it was the last announced expansion franchise going into the '78 season. And I believe Timo and team only had something like 3 months to actually prepare for the beginning of the season. So you can imagine how that scrambled. But then upon your arrival, and in addition to all the other changes that occurred, you literally went almost from a worst to first scenario with a 22-8 record in '79. So albeit losing in the playoffs, but still, he becomes coach of the year. And it's not like you weren't contributing on a high level, right?
Oh, no, I didn't. No, I didn't. I mean, I contributed in the same sense that practice players, or non-starters, in terms of encouragement, in terms of having good practices. I did everything that I could, but our way of holding on to the ball in movement did not include any long ball passes, or very few long ball passes, and I give Timo credit because he wasn't just a one way to do things type of coach, and he saw what he had, and he designed our club that year along those lines, and it worked really, really well. And so I count that as one of the great years of my life, because we as a team went from bottom up to near the top, and it took all of us, a backup goalkeeper, and those of us who, like me, who didn't play that much that year. It was, but it was great. It was great to be part of that. Goodness, and I'm just, in the middle of it, you don't always like a situation, but if you got to. Scripture tells you to do whatever you do with all your heart, with God as your audience, not man. And so that's a Colossians 3:23 deal. And so my focus was to do the best that I could do in a way to honor God and to help the team, not in terms of self-glorification.
So was that understanding and that sort of self-awareness and, frankly, nobility, so to speak, from a personal integrity perspective, did that sort of weigh on you a bit then, and maybe help bring in sort of thoughts of retirement from the outdoor game?
Well, it did, and part of it was because I was told early on, even in Dallas, that you're probably going to be 3-4 years and you're gone. And again, I think Bobby Moffett could have still played personally. And some coaches, they just want to change the culture, and some coaches, I don't think Al Miller ever saw me as a threat to him by any means, but he wanted to get some fresh legs and a fresh approach, and his assessment was that there were better players at my position than I was, and I can't disagree with with him on that. And while I had a really good run, for 5 years or so, going to Houston was tough because I knew that the tornado had sold me, if you will, to Houston. But I was still in the state of Texas, still in UTMO and the way in which, he operated, and happened to be very fortunate to be part of that. Kind of renaissance of the team. You can't say that, it's renaissance is probably a broader, decade, year type of thing. But for that team to come back and for it to play and do as well as we did that year, I was really thrilled to be part of that team.
Did you ever get dragged into the possibility of playing MISL soccer with Houston? Because there was obviously that relationship, whether it was admitted or not, between the Hurricane of the NASL and what was, I guess, dubbed the Houston Summit soccer team in the first 2 years of the MISL. Were you ever part of those discussions, or was that ever a consideration, or was that just not part of it?
Well, not really. I mean, I that's really, to some degree, and I can't remember exactly, but I was happy at that point doing broadcasting and starting to do that as well. And I had done some events for CBS previously, done some events for ESPN, and I ended up having a contract with USA Network, and I was doing college football every fall, and we would have the third game each weekend, third best game each weekend. So ABC, CBS would take number 1 and number 2, and we got number 3, and we had a very, very smart president, a lady there at USA Network, and
Kay Koplovitz.
Yep, and she figured out that you need to get in homes all over America, and that was going to be the big turning point. So she did a lot of things. She was the one who I think came up with the idea of covering PGA golf on Thursdays and Fridays, because you already have the trucks there, you already have the announcers there, you already have the players there. And why should we just limit it to for CBS on Saturday and Sunday? Well, and CBS was happy to do that as well. That helped their marketing for what they were trying to do. And so she was doing the Thursday, Friday broadcasts for the PGA. And we were doing the same thing in college. When the schedule would come out, she would look at that, and it changed rarely, but it could change on occasion based on how a team was doing that particular year. But we ended up, I did a whole bunch of Notre Dame games, did a whole bunch of Miami games, a whole bunch of Boston College games with Doug Flutie. And so from a broadcasting standpoint, that was a really good transition element for me. And in addition to doing my MISL stuff, at one point I was doing Game of the Week for Seattle, where John Best, my former center back for us there in Dallas, he was now general manager up there. I was doing essentially kind of a Game of the Week in Seattle, and also one on Long Island there for the Arrows, and it was got a lot of miles. A lot of airplane miles during those years when I did that.
I growing up in the New York metropolitan area myself, I do remember those first games, and it was very late at night. I guess it was a tape delay kind of situation. It was you and Terry Lewicki, one of the famous Lewicki brothers, doing those New York Arrows games, usually from the Nassau Coliseum. I think occasionally there was a Philadelphia game or some other sort of road games, but
but Nassau, you're exactly right. Yeah, I got a lot of points in the Marriott Hotel right near that particular arena.
It's near the stadium. Yeah, that's the highlight of the Marriott, I'm sure. But it seems to me, though, that from a broadcasting perspective, that you were kind of a quick study. Obviously, very telegenetic. You had to good presence on the air. I see some old pictures of you and Pelé kibitzing during some CBS halftime games of some of the Soccer Bowl from '75, et cetera. It's clear that you were well onto that way. So the MISL, though, seems to be something that you became almost synonymous with. I mean, your games of the week with Al Troutwig, right? Staple of the USA Network in those early 80s.
I missed the core to your question. You said something about Al Troutwig, and then I missed what you.
The game. Those. So for those who don't remember, our listeners, Kyle was the other half of the team that broadcast an MISL game of the week. The other person being Al Troutwig, right? And basically, on the USA Network, that was a staple of its programming for a good 2-3 years, right? Those live games once a week, right? Every night. And
again, it speaks to our president's genius in a lot of ways, is that she wanted to get exciting airtime without having to pay out the nose for the NFL. Or at one time, they also did basketball or baseball. I can't remember which one, but they were, went with that. But what they really kind of figured out was if you got a high energy event on television, then that you can sell ads to, which obviously is where they make their revenue. And she was just very clever about it. The Al Troutwig story is fascinating because Al was just sitting in the stands, and he asked if he could maybe do a tape or two, and our producer said, "Well, sure, I'll listen to the tape." And so he did a game, and our producer just kind of said, "Well, you know what? You're pretty good." And but Kyle's working with another gentleman right now, and we'll see what happens. And there was a little animosity, I guess, between our play-by-play gentleman and our producer. And so, I show up one day and Al Troutwig is there, and we talk to each other and do the game, and he handles everything. And in particular, what Al was great at was pronouncing Eastern European names. and he practiced. He was good at it. He just had a gift for it, but he worked hard at it. I don't mean gift in the sense that he didn't have to work at it, but and he obviously, we've seen him now in the Olympics, and we've seen him do a number of things there in the New York City area. And just physically, when you looked at him, you'd say, he's okay. But once you hear his voice, and he had a very good way of setting things up, and was very committed, very passionate about anything that he did from a broadcasting standpoint. So it was really good to work with him with soccer and to see what he went on to.
I very much want to get him as a guest. He's on the list. I have not yet reached out, but I'm sure hopefully I can get him at MSG now. But do you remember who the announcer was that you were that he replaced by any chance?
Yeah, I do. But I don't want to in any way demean the gentleman. I'll just leave it at that.
Fair enough. And look, I know.
I may call you back and no, but the other gentleman had worked for CBS. He had a good career in basketball, and just the personalities did not. They just didn't work with our producer, and I don't know why, and I wish it in a lot of ways, because he and I did a lot of football together, and the same producer did our football events, who did the soccer events for the most part, and so it's been I have a lot of really good memories of that, because we kind of did the second tier bowls, college football bowl games around New Year's Day and through Christmas, and so we did game of the week football, and then I did some did national track and field events as well for USA Network, and I think ended up doing 4 sports, I think, for them at one point.
Well, you're almost like a utility player of sorts for USA Network, and with a flexing sports.
I was a stable on college football. I was a stable on MISL soccer for them, and then I actually did a rodeo time for them one time down in Oklahoma City, and in addition to the track and field activities. And so the first 3 I felt very competent and could handle, what we would have to deal with. A rodeo, not so much. And I think they thought, because I was from Texas, that I would understand all the rodeo lingo and all that kind of stuff. But
all right, so our completists out there who are listening, we urge you to go find that piece of video of Kyle Rote Jr. calling rodeo in the state of Oklahoma in the early 80s. All right, but so it seems like you're well on your way then. But then, and this is, I do want to sort of make this sort of the last major sort of area here. How do you get back into the game of soccer itself? The appeal of getting actually into owning or being part of an MISL franchise yourself. How did that sort of come about?
Well, I had finished in Houston. I had spent some the summer. I had really kind of felt a call to do this, and when it looked like I was not going to be as big a part of the team because they were going to stay. Timo had a winning. He had a winning style, and whatever the math was going to be, for that next year in 1980, I had always been very impressed with Mother Teresa, and always have felt odd about hunger issues around the world, and that had always just kind of pierced my heart and that kind of thing. And so made a decision that since I was not going to be part of the mainstream of the Houston team, because we had a very good, successful team, the year before, and there was no reason to change it for the most part. So I ended up spending 3 months or so in India, Mother Teresa's work, that kind of thing, and come back and get a phone call from a former Memphis Rogues guy who I knew, and he said, "Look, I see you doing all this MISL stuff, and so you got to know some of these owners, and we need a soccer franchise." And I said, "Well, you know what? I will keep my ears open, and I'll kind of see what happens, and get back in touch with you and see kind of if what interest there might be." Well, as it turned out, one day I'm doing a game in Hartford, and I can't remember who it was that came up to me. It wasn't Michael, but somebody came up to me and said, "Look, we're so glad to have you guys here, but don't say anything about our owner on air. Would you please?" I mean, he asked me to, and I said, "Well, I don't even know what happened to your owner, so yeah, I'm not going to say anything about it." He said, "Well, there looks like there's an issue that involving the IRS, maybe some tax fraud or something." So I ended up calling that day. I called the commissioner and said, "Look, I don't know all the details, but I've had a PR person come from the Hartford, was it Hellions? I can't remember what it was." But,
yes.
And told me about not saying anything about their ownership. And I asked him why, and he told me that, there's an investigation going on and all that kind of stuff. Well, the commissioner said, "Well, thank you so much for telling me about that." And I said, "Oh, but by the way, I got a group of people in Memphis who are looking to get a franchise. And if you think that the Hartford team is up for sale, or wants to, can move, and if they get away from this other situation, maybe this is an easy solution to it. Just transfer to another city." They were a good city for the NASL soccer team, and the Memphis Rogues back then, and they would love to have an indoor soccer team. And part of the backstory on that, Tim, is that Memphis was trying through that. We have a dual mayor system here. We got a county mayor and a city mayor. Both mayors were really trying to help push and our business community was pushing as well, and FedEx is here and all that stuff, to try to get an NFL franchise. And given our average income in the city of Memphis, it doesn't fit anything close to what the NFL needed. But NFL loved using Memphis as kind of a tool to try to negotiate with other cities. Ultimately, the team, ended up going to Nashville, which has a much higher average income per person. And so, they figured that in Memphis you got, for the NFL, maybe you got 30,000 people that can afford season tickets. But in Nashville, even though they're a smaller city, they have probably 70, 80,000 people that could. And they did all their economic research and all that kind of stuff. But that's the reason why they asked me to see if we could get a team, because they said the expansion committee looks at all these things. Memphis has a good golf tournament, which we did and still do. The St. Jude tournament. You've got a good tennis tournament, which we did up until about a year ago. And they said, and by the way, a whole bunch of NFL owners are looking, have already have a piece of a number of soccer teams over the years, and so there are a lot of NFL owners who really like soccer. And so, in any event, the people here in Memphis, I talked to both mayors, and they say, those folks, would you try to help us as kind of a front man to get in touch with the commissioner and see if maybe we can get a team, if not Hartford, another one, but the Hartford one sounds, that maybe they'd be willing to consider that. Well, I get a phone call back, and shockingly, they did want to consider that. And so we ended up got a group of owners, of which I was one, that we ended up owning the team that ultimately became the Memphis Americans. Used to be the Hartford Hellions, and we kept, I think, 4 or 5 players off that team, and then added some others, and Stan Stomenkovich was one of those who became a real star in our little community here. But we had some other really good players that we were able to get from Hartford. We got Tom Nevers, and who else? Bruce Rudroff, and Leo Figueredo, and there's one other one I think we got. Richard Boot, who is still here, by the way. He was a goalkeeper.
Sure.
And was an excellent goalkeeper for us with the Memphis Americans. Memphis Americans lasted 3 years. We sold the franchise to Las Vegas, where it went out there, and I guess, the league imploded, and they didn't do as well as I guess they expected at the time. I was offered a job to go there, but my wife was here. She's from the state of Tennessee. Our kids were happy in school, and I was in a position where I didn't absolutely have to move just to survive. And so we ended up staying here and became host of a TV show here called Knowledge Bowl, and for 18 years hosted that television show for CBS. And it's since been kind of franchised to some other cities and that kind of thing. And continued to do my football, continued to do MISL stuff. And so my temporary move to Memphis in 1981 turned into a permanent move because we're still here. And so.
All right, last couple of questions. All right, so but that's a really interesting story. So did you ever sort of was the irony ever evident in that here you are part of an Athletes in Action Christian-oriented acquisition of a team that was called the Hellions? Did that ever dawn on you as being somewhat ironic?
Well, no, I mean, it was anytime you mix people have a different worldview. You've got some struggles, and I'll say that from our ownership, of which included several Jewish doctors here in town, it was we were trying to do it as much for the city of Memphis, and I didn't know the city of Memphis, as well as I obviously have now, and so we had some really exciting time, but the mix of players, Derek Smethurst, I don't know if you remember Derek,
Sure.
but he was a really good forward, and Derek was on our team, and so we had about, I'd say probably half Christian that you could identify players, and the other half weren't, but that wasn't. We did a number of things around the community that were basically giving activities, just trying to bless people and do things to encourage them and that kind of stuff. But the base had already been set. The Memphis Rogues, that previous group, had done a fabulous job of inculcating a love of soccer among the Memphis people, and so we were fortunate to have some good crowds and that kind of thing, and I think Helmut Dudek and Hank Leotard and Tony Carbagnani, all those guys, and Richard Booth. Most of those guys are still I think of that group, several of them are still here. A tremendous Helmut Dudek was a fabulous kind of left back for us. He ended up dying of cancer a few years ago, and Stan Stamenkovic sadly was killed in an accident falling off the top of a roof. I don't know how anyway, that's I'll let someone else figure all that out. And so I've tried to keep up with, a good number of them over the years, but we really didn't have any, major issues within the team, other than we didn't win as much as we wanted to, and one of my former teammates was our first coach, Horst Bertel, who played in Germany and was never on the German national team, but he was close, and so he had married an American girl, and so they were trying to establish citizenship here and that kind of thing. And Horst and I played together in Houston. He came from Houston as well. And so from that Houston group, Horst Bertel came, and then also Matt O'Sullivan came from there. So there were really kind of three of us who came from the Houston soccer program up to assist those people here in Memphis.
And the other irony, as people are yelling at their iPods as they're listening to this episode, of course, is that the Memphis Americans were comprised of many non-Americans for quite some time, and you've named just a bunch of all, right? So that's that irony there as well.
Well, we played at every arena. They always have their song. We would play that "Coming to America" song. The very popular Coming to America song. And I still get people coming up to me, this many years later, who so love that, this idea of coming to America to start your life and to have a fresh look and all of that. I had no idea the power of that music, but we played it loud, and we, of course, we did the national anthem, but the music element, when you put together, you produce, a game. That surprised me as to how important that became, and people would stand up and sing, and it's a pretty easy lyric to remember. So. It was just a very loud experience, and it made us, as for the home team, feel really good because most everybody in the crowd would end up singing that song as well.
All right, one quick question, and then we promise to wrap it up because we've spent quite a bit of time denting your afternoon, and I want to give back the bulk of your time to yourself and your family. Were you I read somewhere, don't know if it's true or not. Were you offered the chance to coach in Dallas afterwards, or was that is that also apocryphal?
I was committed to stay here. I was called, and that's about all I can say. Even though Dallas was where I was born, it's where I played high school stuff. It's where I had the pleasure of playing with Lamar Hunt's team and all that. But, the kids were happy. And as a child, I don't mean this in any negative way towards my mother and father, we switched. It was also a time in the NFL when every player had to have an off-season job because you didn't make enough money in the NFL during the 50s.
Huh.
And so Pat Summerall went back to Jacksonville, Florida, and sold insurance. Our quarterback, Charlie Connerly of the Giants, went back to Clarksdale, Mississippi. He had a shoe store that he worked every off season. Frank Gifford, I think, went to the West Coast and sold pictures of himself out in a swimsuit. But everybody, Andy Robustelli had a sporting goods store up in Connecticut, and everybody had to have essentially another job, another revenue stream. And so I kind of grew up going from city to city. We'd be in New York, and then we go to San Antonio. We'd be in New York, and then we go back to Dallas and be in New York. And so really didn't have a lot of stability. And one of the things that I said to myself as the oldest son of the 4 kids that my mom and dad had was, wow, when I get married, I want to try to give to our kids the stability of kind of the same environment, the same city as best as I can. And so that's part of what's driven us to stay here in Memphis and to try to give our kids that stability.
Well, look, and it's an amazing testament to being a father, being part of a family, and recognizing the sacrifices that life brings beyond either a career or simply the delight and the joy of playing sports as that career, right? And it's life is complicated, and those are not necessarily easy decisions to make. But it does seem to me that the easiest decision to make with regards to the totality of your career, right, was certainly made and rectified in 2009 when you were inducted to 2 halls of fame as an English major. I believe that's how we say it. But not only the state of Texas, but also the National Soccer Hall of Fame. There's some argument that it should have happened a bit sooner than 2009, but I'll let others conjecture around that. I have to suspect that is at least some level of gratitude, and arguably still probably more to come as the sport gets more successful by the year here in this modern age, of your contributions and a lot of what you've mentioned throughout this conversation, which is almost to the point of being a missionary in some respects for a sport that truly needed those kinds of efforts back in the 70s and early 80s.
Yeah. Well, there were a lot of sacrifices. My wife obviously had to make a lot of sacrifices, but to an earlier question, when I would fly out on a Thursday night to go into a city to try to promote the game that we were going to play on Saturday, that meant that I couldn't be with the Dallas Tornado for our Friday kind of pregame, walkthrough and practice. And so a lot of times I would end up meeting the players at the hotel after they had just landed from Dallas. And so there was a sacrifice, for them because they put up with me not being at the last practice before us going into a game. And the coaches, same way, Ron Newman, and same kind of deal. But that was part of that's what I understood. And Pelé, I think, is the one who really kind of taught me that. Not so much. I didn't sit in the classroom with him. I just watched, the man, and he always was able to be positive and be greeting. I know he had to be dead tired most of the time, but he still always smiled. He still always waved. He still always did what he did, and it had nothing to do with what he was going to do on the field. But he was just such a good salesperson on behalf of the game, and I think he took bringing soccer to America. As many of the Cosmo publications said, that was his challenge, was to bring soccer to America, help bring a higher respect for the game here in America, and he certainly accomplished that. So just watching the way he handled things, and I'm not saying he never got a yellow card. I don't know if he got any red cards, but he played the game athletic. He played it hard. But he picked people up, and people seemed to really respect him. And so even though I didn't know him, super well, we played against each other, and we had a number of these events together. But in terms of really core, to really know all about him, when they in Biafra in Africa, when he came, there was a civil war going on, and he put a condition on coming to that part of the world. And he said, I will only come if you guys stop fighting. And despite all the previous efforts by the governments, by both sides, by military, by everybody else to quit fighting, they continued to fight. But when Pelé came, they stopped. And when I think about issues that have happened in Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, in terms of little border wars and all that kind of thing, certainly soccer on occasion sets a platform, for great athletic performance, but it also has a political element to it as well, and a political power. And when you join that with someone like Pelé, who, I've never met anyone who didn't really like him, in addition to respecting him for the remarkable accomplishments that he had. So I just tried to take a tone, just kind of watching the master of how he did it. I could never match his athletic or his soccer skills, but his ambassador skills were A+, and I always wanted to try to make sure I never embarrassed the game and tried to honor him.
Well, I think you were the complete diametric opposite of an embarrassment. You're obviously a true pioneer of the sport. This is partially why we do these conversations, because there's a whole element of soccer fan here in the United States. I mean, arguably it's an embarrassment of riches these days, given what's transpired in the game. Obviously, still lots yet to come, but without the pioneering work, and I hate to overuse that word, but it's apt here. These on the shoulders of others, makes this sport and has made this sport so persistently successful, in today's modern age. So, to the fact that you're at least recognized by whatever halls of fame you could qualify for is a small recognition, arguably, of your contributions to the game and the sport in this country.
Well, I'm very honored to be part of an army of people. Again, some of whom you've already, Michael Minchell and Bobby and some of the other folks that you have talked to that were all part of that and had different, perhaps, assignments, but we were all trying to keep smiles on young people's faces, and even though they might have sweat on their brow, it was with a smile, and that's the magic of the game of soccer. And I don't worship it in the sense that it's above my God worship, but I certainly am very thankful that the game exists, because it's done a lot of good.
All right, this will be the last question, I promise. Can you ever have imagined where the sport of soccer would be in this day and age? And what is your assessment of it? MLS and all the minor leagues and the U.S. national team success levels. There's got to be some element of pride, perhaps, in what you helped sort of usher in the early days. How about the future of the sport? Do you think it's pretty strong?
Well, I do. In one way, I look at the women's game and the remarkable success they had because all the women's world, for the most part, women's soccer all started at the same time. All goes back to, I think, 1972 and Title IX and that kind of thing. And our ladies have done extremely well, and obviously not every culture, not every, has women's soccer and all that kind of stuff, but they've done really, really well. We're about a century behind in men's soccer. And so when a child is born in my era, in the 70s, very, very few parents would ever think of a vision, well, one day he'll be a soccer player. There was always, one day he'll be maybe a football, basketball, baseball player, something like tennis, golf, those kinds of things. Thankfully, that has now changed in many ways to where soccer is part of the conversation. And we still haven't seen the best benefits of that because if you look at, Brazil just as an example, okay, if you're a great athlete in Brazil, you've got basically one choice, maybe two. You could say the Brazilian basketball program, and arguably, they're pretty good at that kind of thing. And maybe it could be you could be an international race car driver. They've had some success with that. But 98% of kids born in Brazil, at least have a view that to play the game of soccer at some level, that kind of thing. We're by far the most diverse country in the world in terms of sports opportunity. And we're not forced to have to play only one sport like they are in some countries. And we have this wonderful menu. It's just one of the best, I think, one of the best parts, really of America, that your size, doesn't keep you from playing the game of soccer for the most part. And we have so many choices, and that's part of our freedom, and part of the difficulty of managing our freedom is, which one do you do? I've always told people, when people say about your kids, well, like, if I'll give you a good example, Roger Staubach, he and I, friends when I lived in Dallas, and he was playing with the Cowboys, and he did not let his son, Jeff, play football until his senior year of high school. Jeff became a very good soccer player. Jeff became a very good baseball player. And part of the reason Roger did that is because of the concussion issue that is continuing to grow as an issue in American football. And so, I'm not a prognosticator. I'm not a seer. I can't tell you what's going to happen in the future, but I would imagine that as the American football sport continues to have to deal with the concussion challenges, that a lot more kids are going to be, a lot more young people are going to be ushered into playing soccer. And I don't wish badly for American football at all, because my whole family has background with that and my broadcasting of the sport and all of that. But certainly soccer gives a very good alternative to really good athletes. And when you look at the rest of the world, when I was on there are 210 nations in the world. When I played on our national team, we weren't 210, but we were probably in the 60s somewhere, 60s, 70s. We beat Poland in my first game. We beat Bermuda, I think, in the second game, and then had a whole string of losses to Mexico and Poland and Italy and all of that. And so we sometimes get these little false senses that, well, we've made it and we're just as good as all the other top soccer teams in the world, and that's not quite the case. I mean, we're certainly moving in that direction, but this idea of an alternative to American football is a very enticing one for me as I look at it, and as more and more parents who know that I play both sports would say, well, what do you think? What would you advise? And I said, well, look, I'm not an expert on brain science. There are other people that you ought to ask questions about that. But let me just tell you what Roger did with his son, what Staubach did with his son, and that was he kept him out of football until he was really fully developed. And you can argue what that age group is, but that's probably 15, 16, 17, somewhere in there, and had him play other sports because of his concern for the health of his son. And so I think that's going to end up becoming a bigger issue nationally of how do we enjoy the game of American football without having to incur the risks that we have had. We don't put people in the military until they're at least 18, I think. And I'm not suggesting that that's the rule that they ought to adopt in American football, but it may be something that they ought to at least look at. That I get really scared and sad when I see 4th and 5th graders playing tackle football because of the physical development hasn't matured enough to provide a safe body to be able to take some of those impact hits. And I think just out of the enthusiasm, I don't think parents ever do it intentionally, want to put their children in harm. I think they just don't understand, they just don't know what can happen with youth sports, injuries particularly in that sport. And I see soccer as perhaps a beneficiary of that.
Sure. And obviously with collegiate programs robustly available and a major league and a thriving and growing minor league system in the United States, there's actually professional and or other benefits of soccer beyond just a play school thing or a playground thing in the one's early years just for fun. And again, it come back to some of those pioneering efforts that folks like you made happen, right? And those foundations, those building blocks, right? I've arguably set up, such a smorgasbord of opportunity that the sport can actually act as an entree for many kids today, and as a viable option, even as a career. And that's that's lost, I think, on this generation in terms of where that came from. But it is not lost to people like myself and our listeners about who should get some of the credit or a lot of the credit for those building blocks.
Well, Tim, it's been a joy talking to you and to talk to someone who's followed the game for a long period of time. And I thank you for the phone call, and good to talk with you.
Okay, there you have it. And friends, I am not going to lie to you. That was a real thrill to get to talk to Kyle Rote Jr., a legend and a true superstar in every sense of the word, pun intended. And somebody that I have grown to admire over the years, ever since I was a kid, and enthralled by the original days of the North American Soccer League and my own little fledgling soccer career, short-lived as it might have been as a youth. Kyle Rote Jr. is a wonderful human being, and I think you got a sense of that, and the stories and the history as well, just top-notch, and I can't thank him enough. I want to remind you that Kyle is available for public speaking engagements. He does a ton of those. And if you have a civic organization or a sports group that could be inspired by Kyle's story and exploits, I think you would benefit by giving him an email to kyle.rotejr, that's ROTEJR, at gmail.com. Again, that's kyle.rotejr, ROTEJR, at gmail.com, and he will hopefully respond in kind, and you can figure out how Kyle can come speak to your group. I think that too would be a fun exchange, and lots to learn from the great Kyle Rote Jr. And we can't again thank him enough for being part of our fledgling little podcast here on episode number 19. Boy, has time flown. Again, thank you for listening. Follow us on social media. You find us on Twitter at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. On Facebook, we have a page devoted to the site, obviously Good Seats Still Available. And our website, of course. If you can't remember any of this stuff or there's something you forgot, you want to download an episode in the past or all of the episodes, you want to get a book or a movie or anything else we've referenced on the show, the place to find it, all of that is goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's our website. Visit early, visit often. Thank you so much for your support. Please rate and review us on iTunes or wherever you can rate and review podcast episodes. We benefit and love those too. And stay tuned. We've got lots of other great conversations and interviews and stories to come. And we thank you for your support thus far. My name's Tim Hanlon. This is the podcast we call Good Seats Still Available. Thank you for listening. And I can't wait to see you again or listen or talk to you again, whatever, sometime soon. Take care, everybody.